once again back to Joshua, and in chapter 11, the significant part of this, of course, is militarily, we have a change in campaign. We have discovered, once we got into the book of Joshua, God's chosen servant to replace Moses, take the nation into the promised land, and all kinds of things that we've seen as God has provided for the conclusion of this. But with this, of course, when they came up out of the Negev and hit Kadesh Barnea, 40 years wandering around down here, and then came up and took on Og and Bashan and all this stuff, and then wound up going across here at Jericho. The idea, it makes perfect sense, is you drive a wedge through here, and then you conquer half, and so that you're not fighting on two fronts at the same time. Militarily, you can see it make perfect sense. Joshua was a military commander, so it was with God's endorsement, so to speak. They had a couple of glitches along the way with getting it figured out. You better do things God's way, even when God's way sounds a little weird. Marching around a town, yelling and hollering and all that stuff is not the normal assault method for conquering. Yeah. But then the run ahead of God with perhaps just a hint of arrogance. When it came to the next town, Ai just dumped the nation right into a screeching halt. And they had to get that squared away. And then the southern campaign picked up speed, moved across here, and just ran through. And of course, you had this incident with the Gibeonites, we've already talked about. And then they flowed down this way and conquered much of. Now, once again, book of Joshua, when it comes to the whole military conquest thing, is in some ways similar to the book of Judges in the fact that you're looking at a checkerboard type of pattern. You're not talking about 100% conquest of every acre of the entire land all the way down to the Red Sea. You're talking about Joshua's armies going in and, for the most part, defeating the major cities and the major people groups, which leaves a huge amount of small little areas and resistance movements, okay, and local guerrilla warfare bands that are not real happy with Israel, still alive and well, holding their own and doing everything they can to cause issues with God's conquest of the land. So don't think when it talks about, and the land was at rest. Yeah, the land was at rest, except for the fact that you had a whole lot of people that had refused to acknowledge, the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and all the other people in there that weren't 100% every man, woman, and child that wasn't in subjugation. They still had some hostile forces. The way God designed this was to go in to conquer the land, okay? And we're going to look at the northern campaign in a moment, but to conquer the land, and with the major resistant areas taken care of, then break the land up into the tribe portion segments. Reuben gets this, Issachar gets this, Gad gets this. Now their responsibility was to continue that subjugation until they had cleansed all those pockets of resistance. But it wasn't the responsibility, apparently, of the Israelite army as a whole to worm through every patch of trees and every hut tucked away, under a palm frond someplace, to make sure that they were eliminated. Okay? And for the most part, that's what Israel was expected to do. Okay? Eliminate them, kill them all, take them out. Okay? Not go to bed with them. Because as soon as that happened, as we've seen in the book of Judges in the last few weeks, you have essentially the biggest problem is actually spiritual idolatry. Because when you get into that compromise situation, then pretty soon false worship systems, false gods creep into things, and now there's all kinds of problems. Okay, so it's not just marrying the foreign wife, that is the issue. It's the foreign wife comes with baggage, and the baggage is the worship of false gods, and it's real easy to make a little compromise here, a little compromise there, for peace in the home. We'll just, play that down, we'll make an issue of it. Well, the saying about nits becoming lice and mountains, or molehills becoming mountains, yeah, it happens, and we saw it happen in Israel. So you have all this upset now that will flow from the book of Joshua right into the book of Judges, and chronologically it just goes all through those centuries that are in there. Okay? So with this major conquest taken care of, there is one exception that not hardly anything is written about, and that's the city of Jerusalem. Okay, and I have no idea. Okay, there's various expert opinions that don't agree. Always fun when you talk about that. But Jerusalem just seems to have been bypassed. But it was a major city-state even then. But it was just bypassed. What do we assume? Watch out with assumptions. I don't know what you would assume there. Did God give instructions that we don't have in Scripture to bypass until a later date? Was it too strong for the armies of Joshua? It may have been, but it certainly wasn't too strong for the armies of God. I mean, let's face it, when all you got to do is shout and have the priest blow the horn, the whole town falls in. It's that God wasn't that intimidated by Jerusalem, militarily speaking. So that probably wasn't the issue. For whatever reason, Jerusalem is bypassed by the armies of Joshua during this southern campaign. Maybe it was expected that after Judah inherited that portion of the land, that there would be a further military effort. You can research that. Good luck with that. There's just not a lot of information on it. As chapter 11 opens, you wind up with the northern campaign. So we find it came to pass when Jabin, and here's a whole list of city-state kings, small area guys by our standards, rulers of towns, rulers of counties, rulers of regional area, populations and military capability. Jabin, the king of Hazor, had heard of these things. He sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshapha. That's a good one there. And to the kings on the north of the mountains and of the plain south of Chinneroth. Okay, you got a different word for Chinneroth? Somebody should have. Chinneroth is the name for the Sea of Galilee. Okay, it's the ancient name for it. One of, but this was the original ancient name for it. So from having the southern campaign, now you have what it amounts to serious communication with kings of populations of ites, okay, that are in the northern part of the promised land. So as you had a southern coalition of kings tried to resist Israel's armies, now you've got a northern coalition as well. Okay? In the valley, the borders of Dor on the west, the Canaanite, verse 3, on the east and the west, the Amorite, the Hittite, Perizzite, Jebusite, in the mountains, the Hivite under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. Okay, here's Hermon up here. Okay, so you're getting up, you're extending, and again, here to here is about 70 miles. Okay. Now it doesn't sound much like us today. We hop in our car and we drive 70 miles to get a hot dog. But when you did everything on foot, following your donkeys that carried the provision, 70 miles is quite a ways. Also, and Dave did a good job of pointing this out, you have the mountainous strip that runs all the way down through here. Okay? Now we're talking about rocky and rugged, with chasms that run across. I mean, think Hell's Canyon in miniature, but running across. There are only limited ways, access, and traffic patterns. You just didn't wander out through there any place and get where you were going. It was had restricted travel routes, which meant restricted military routes as well. Okay? You had, on some areas you had plain areas in here and plain areas out here. You had some plains off down in here, but and of course down in here, you get down in here and it turns into almost desert by our standards. But the Northern Campaign had the response of a coalition of resisting kings, resisting peoples, and you get the idea. Verse 4 says, they went out and all their hosts with them. Hosts, think armies, armed forces. Much people, even as sand upon the seashore in the multitude, horses and chariots, very many. And when all these kings met together, they came and pitched together in the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Waters of Merom, it would be out in here, okay? So you kind of get the idea. They are they've gathered this coalition of armed forces. They are doing their best to find the right place so that their horses and chariots and numbers can be put best to the advantage. Just pick your battlefield. Okay, everybody here knows that if you're a fighter pilot, you try to have the sun at your back when you dive into your gun run. Okay, because it's really hard to see squinting at the sun if you're trying to figure out where the enemy is. Okay? Same type of a thing, even in land warfare. You try to get the high ground. In biblical times, it was a huge advantage to have the high ground, okay? Because it's a lot more strenuous over 6, 8, 12 hours of battle to fight uphill than it was to fight downhill. Okay? Just stop and think about how much easier it is with gravity on your side. And so the commanders tried to pick the battlefield. What's most advantageous to us? A lot of pre-battle maneuvering had the intent of giving me the high ground. Whether I use cavalry action, of course these guys, Israel doesn't have any chariots. They don't have any horses. Okay? To you and I, that may not sound like, well, whoop-de-doo. But humanly speaking, the chariots and horses had significant advantage on a military basis if you were going to go into some type of a battle scenario. Okay? So keep that in mind. Okay, verse 6. The Lord said to Joshua, don't be afraid because of them. Wow. How neat. When you've got the God of creation, bonks you on the side. I don't know how he said it. It says the Lord said to him, I'm taking that literally, so it's in some form or fashion, God directly communicated to Joshua that, hey, if you've got me on your side, you don't have to worry about the chariots. You don't have to worry about the high ground. You do it the way I tell you to do it, and you don't have any issues. Okay? Tomorrow, about this time, I will deliver up all slain before Israel. Okay? You shall hew their horses. You horse people, you know what that is?
Hamstring them.
Hamstring them. Put them out of, it basically you are relegating them to dog food.
They can't.
Because they can't jump. They can't put any power. They can kind of hobble around, but that's all they can do. Yeah. Okay. You'll hew their horses and burn their chariots with fire. He's telling them the outcome of tomorrow's battle. So Joshua came, all the people of war with him, against them by the waters of Merom suddenly and fell upon them. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who smote them, chased them unto great Zidon, unto the really long word that's hard to pronounce, it really is, Mishrephothaim, unto the valley of Mizpah eastward, and smote them until they left none remaining. And Joshua did unto them as the Lord bade him. hewed their horses, burnt their chariots with fire. Now, please note, what is significant about this whole horse chariot stuff? Anything beyond just the obvious, that the horses wound up with tendons cut, and what?
You just captured an entire armor division and destroyed it.
Yeah.
Rather than using it.
You captured the enemy's armory. And instead of saying, cool, now we have horses and chariots. God doesn't let them depend upon horses and chariots. Okay? I mean, the Israelite nation here has defeated the enemy. There's chariots standing around everywhere with horses hooked up. You've killed all the men. Hey, it's our loot. We just gained a whole new dimension to any future battles. Now we can, and God says, no, you can't. This is all about me. You didn't need me to defeat this army any more than you need, or you didn't need the chariots and the horses to defeat this bunch. You had me. You didn't, all you had was me at Ai. All you had was me at Jericho. All you had was me throughout the southern campaign. Don't put your trust in horses and chariots. Remember later on, there was one of King David had an issue with trusting in chariots. Okay? So you kind of get the idea of what the purpose of it, because on the surface level, you capture all their tanks and all their surface-to-air missile sites. You just don't set C4 charges and blow everything up and then hike back home. As we were grunts, but there's doughboys and ground pounders, and what do they call you guys? Ground pounders. Is that what you were? Okay. Different generations have different names for them. It's infantry. Okay. I mean, you can imagine these guys. Some of these guys, they've been hiking all the way from here, fighting and battling, all the way doing this and that, and all the way up here, and they go all the way up here, and they finally get in a big battle, and they look out there and says, "Ha! Wow! Whew. Now I get to ride home in a chariot." And God says, "Now you get to walk back." Yeah. Okay. So, infantry's delight, right? Verse 10. Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor. Ta-da! Hazor, where's Hazor? Here it is. Turn back. See, he's operating here and then looping around underneath Mount Hermon on this big plain. Everything that goes north of Chinnereth, or Sea of Galilee, as we call it. Everything that goes with it. And it says, he smote the king with the sword. For Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. No, this was the kingpin. This was the major guy who had brought together this coalition of military force in the north, and Joshua lops his head off after capturing the place. On top of that, he says, when they smote all the souls in the city of Hazor with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, there was not left any to breathe, and he burned it with fire. Okay. So far, so good? All right, verse 12. And all the cities of those kings, and all the kings of them did Joshua take, and smote them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. But, now here's a distinctive in verse 13. The cities that still stood in their strength, Israel burned none of them, Hazor only, okay, it's as far as a major city, that Joshua burnt, and all the spoil of these cities, the cattle the children of Israel took for loot, bounty, prey, it says here. It was their reward. But every man they smote with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, neither left they any to breathe. So they went in, killed all the people, captured all of the loot, but left the towns intact. Okay. Well, Israel is going to occupy that land. Okay. You've got built-in suburban housing development here. Okay. The dead people don't need their houses anymore. Israel needs places to live. And so that's the way God provided it. Simple enough for you? Okay. So you kind of get the idea of what's going on. Israel has now gone all the way up through here, all the way over, all the way down through, checkerboarded back, worked its way all the way up here, fought battles around, and it was now in the process of coming back down. Okay? And they were hitting this town and that town. Anything that had been part of this coalition against them, they wiped out. And, the men took everything for bounty. Was to the victor the spoils, I suppose. Okay? It tells us then in verse 15, as the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so did Moses command Joshua. That's chapter 1. And so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. That's a pretty good epitaph, by the way, if you're looking for one. So Joshua took all that land, the hills, and all the south country, all the land of Goshen. Now, again, Goshen, we're not real sure, but Goshen is down in here somewhere. This is not Egypt's Goshen, okay? Different, okay? So don't get confused. And the valley, the plain, the mountain of Israel, the mountain of the same, from the mount of Halak that goes up to Seir, even unto Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon under Mount Hermon. Now you're clear off up in here. Okay, it's again, he's now describing a panorama of all of the conquest, both north and south. So it goes on and says, all their kings he took, smote and slew them. Verse 18, Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. Okay. About 8 years, between 8 and 9 years, from the time they crossed the Jordan until the last major battle that's recorded here in the book. Okay. That seems to fit the chronology the best. Again, that does not mean 100% of the Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites who were completely eliminated. There were going to be small areas, there were going to be pockets of resistance, there were going to be towns that still needed to be conquered. The responsibility of each tribe to mop up is pictured, as the book continues and as we unfold it. That was the individual tribe's responsibility from everything we can glean from the scriptures. Okay? The major conquests were for the armies of Israel. But those armies can only be armies for so long. Somebody's got to plant crops and tend to flocks. You can only, that's why you had this, when these, remember Manasseh and Ephraim and so forth, the 2.5 tribes that settled on the Cisjordan, okay? They only took half of the men. And they rotated them back and forth through that 8 years, because once you establish homeland, somebody's got to be there to protect it, to work the land, to take care of the stock and get the crops. Otherwise, you're not going to have a homeland to go back to. Okay? Because while the Bible doesn't mention it, you got a whole lot of other ites out here that are more than happy to take advantage of the fact that these guys left their women and kids unprotected and they're over here messing around in the hill country. We'll just sneak over there and get a little loot for ourselves. Okay? Tactics. God understood that, but you can only fight for so long, and now you have the response. You can live off other people's loot, right? Think about it. They are capturing not just the weapons, the horses, and the chariots. They're also capturing the grain stores, the corn, all your stuff that is food, along with resupplies for weapons and everything that goes with it. They could keep going so long as you keep capturing. But now the major capturing is done. The major city-states have been conquered. Now these guys have got to go home and go back to being farmers, tradesmen, people that take care of their families. So you've got now a vocational upheaval. They've been wanderers for an entire generation, with a few skirmishes as they got closer to the promised land, and then they became warriors for almost a decade. And now they get to be farmers for the rest of their lives. That's essentially what they're doing. So transition, isn't it? A lot of transition. Okay? Verse 19, there was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. We've already talked about them earlier, right? All other they took in battle, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that he's talking about the Canaanites, harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly, that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them as the Lord commanded Moses. God did not have an interest in finding Israel's spiritual focus compromised by allowing the idolatry of the Canaanite tribes to find its way into Israel's worship of the one true God. Okay? Unfortunately, remember, all of these individual tribes that were given the command to take care of all of the remaining opposition didn't always do a very good job. And with that, as the generations developed, now you've got the rise of foreign wives, the idolatry that goes with it, alliances outside of God and Israel, and all kinds of stuff that has to do with trade and commerce and everything that goes with it. So yeah, it's a familiar thing. It really is. Now 21 through 23 is kind of a vignette, I suppose. At that time, Joshua. At that time came Joshua, cut off the Anakims from the mountains. Okay, Anakims. We've had all these ites. We've gotten kind of used to the ites. But now you've got a Kims in here. Who are these people?
Aren't they descended from the giant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Children of Anak.
Hmm?
They're the children of Anak.
Yeah, Anak, children of Anak. When you think about Anakim, that's what they are. Okay. Down here along the coast, you had a number of Philistine cities. Now, that was a whole area in itself. Now, today we call that the Gaza Strip, off down in here. Was causing problems, for Israel 3,000 years ago or more. It's still causing problems for Israel today. But from out of that, you had various tribal groups, and some of them had migrated into various places. They seemed to like the hill country more so. This is one. Goliath, was one of those, and they were bona fide giants. We're talking about people 9 feet in height. Okay, and you think, wow, that's ridiculous. I'd never believe that. Really? You haven't watched the NBA anytime recently, or the NFL or something. Most any Sunday in the fall, you've got 22 giants out there on the field trying to kill each other. You've got guys, pro basketball players that are 7'2", 4, 6. I mean, they're wow. The head would brush the lights going through here. Huge people by our everyday type standard. The Watusi in Africa, the women run 7 feet. The men are 7'4", 7'5", 7'6". Their bloodlines may not still be pure as such, but 50, 60, 70 years ago, they were. So how much of that is still there, I don't know. But the Anakims, the giants, there was a race, a sub-race, a genetic pool of big people. From the mountains, from Hebron, from Deber, from Anab, and all the mountains of Judah. Okay, this is all this stuff right in here. All this hill mountains country that is wrapped around in here. It'd be west of Jericho, in that whole mountainous area, all kinds of little tribes. It says, Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. Sounds good for there. Yeah, okay. There was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel except, okay, sounds good up until you get to the except, in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. These were all Philistine cities, okay, that for the most part laid down on the coastal areas. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses, gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to the divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from war. Yeah, from the whole nation moving its entire army in the southern and northern campaigns, the land rested. Okay. Guerrilla warfare is still going to be the rule of the day for generation after generation after generation. Simply because when the tribes inherit, and that's what chapter 12 is about, okay, the division of the land, when the tribes inherit with that, because God had used Joshua to complete the overall military campaigns, but now the tribes bear the responsibility to do what you and I would call the mop-up work. Clean out the remaining pockets of existence. Israel, for the most part, didn't do such a good job of that. They wound up marrying them instead, or trading with them because they were too much hassle to try to root them out of the caves up there at the top of the hill. Okay? Or that was too heavily defended and they didn't want to see any of their young guys die, so they made just a compromise treaty with them, or whatever. Well, pretty soon you're back to intermarriage and idolatry. Jack?
I'm just thinking this is similar to Afghanistan now. You know, they can't clean them out.
Can't clean them out, no. One thing, regardless of what you feel about the Afghans, they're pretty tough fighters. They really are. The Russians learned that for, 14 years, I think it was, 16 years. Russians went in there with the superior technology going against the cavemen, and 14 years later just packed up what was left of their group and went back to Russia because, these guys are just tough. That's all there is to it.
And then we took over.
Yeah, and then we took over, and we haven't done any better, but anyway, chapter 12 doesn't take too long to go through. Not the way I do it. Because if you want a map of how the land was divided, Google it. Or better yet, look it up in something that is a reasonable biblical source and find out how the land was carved up, which tribe got what where, everything that went with it. But we'll just high grade the first part and then skip the last part with all of the kings and all the names that were conquered. These are the kings of the land when the children of Israel smote and possessed their land on the other side of the Jordan toward the rising of the sun. That's what's called the Transjordan, the west side of the Jordan River. They'd already conquered this area. Okay, get the idea. Okay, toward the rising from the river Arnon to unto Mount Hermon, all the plain on the east. That's the whole east side. That would be the Cisjordans. You get the idea. Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, ruled from Aroer, which is upon the bank of the river Arnon, from the middle of the river, from the half Gilead. You getting tired of this yet? Because nobody really follows this kind of stuff unless you are, what do they call a mapologist? Cartographer. Thank you. If you're a cartographer into biblical history, Old Testament history, this is neat stuff. You can whip out your big and start drawing lines and have a grand time. I just look it up. Okay, so you've got all of this, and it gives you a list of kings now that are conquered down through here, and he's going to, again, this is going to turn the tribes loose here in just a few minutes, so to speak. He's going to delegate which tribe goes what direction. This is a list of the various kings. Starts with Og, the king of Bashan, which is off down over here. Okay? This started way back before they ever got to the miraculous crossing of the Jordan, which was of the remnant of the giants and dwelt at Ashtaroth and in Edrei and reigned in Mount Hermon and Salca and all these different guys and their offspring and their cousins and nephews and brother-in-laws and the different splinter groups that had gone out and settled different areas. Okay, all these different people that are here. And verse 6 says, them did Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the children of Israel smite. And Moses, the servant of the Lord. Notice it says Moses. You're back to pre-Joshua here in its historicity. And the servant of the Lord gave it for a possession to the Reubenites, to the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh. He just described in 2 verses how it was all split up down here. Ta-da! There it is. Now, you go from there. Now, Emily and I were talking too about when you get to the more specific division of the land and everything that go with it, you have to recognize that the promised land was what the physical promised inheritance of the tribes of the nation of Israel. So such things as boundary markers and piles of stone that said the property line goes here, you weren't just messing with your neighbor when you moved the fence line. You were messing with God's inheritance to a particular group inside of Israel compared to the group on the other side of the property line. These things were holy and sanctified and defended to the death. This is and still remains, if you really talk to the serious Jew in Israel, these are God's property lines. This is God's people that have been given the promised land from God himself, and there is no expiration date on the inheritance rights. It's perpetual. So you've had all kinds of battles that then have taken place since then. Moorish invasions, crusades, so-called Christian knights, which were mostly just the guys emptied out of jails, in Europe, and etc. Well, you can either rot in a jail. Here's the offer. You can rot in a jail and eventually be tortured to death, or we can put a suit on you and give you a shield with the cross on the front, and you can go down towards Palestine, and you can rape, pillage, loot, and plunder, and anything you get, you can bring home for yourself. Your choice. Well, that's a real hard one to make. Rot in jail for the next 12 years, or have a chance to become a rich man and come home with loot and plunder. That was what was thrown on the table as an offer. So you have all kinds of military actions that are going to take place in the years, centuries ahead, clear up through modern times, isn't it? Yeah, get everything goes with it. Okay. So, verse 7, then these are the kings of the country that Joshua smote on this side of the Jordan, and he gives a whole list of the kings of Jericho and the king. It even talks about, in verse 10, now here's an interesting, the king of Jerusalem. But the book never records any type of military action against Jerusalem. Okay? Which, can you make an assumption here without getting out on a very dangerously thin branch? That there must have been some type of coalition involvement in this southern conquest, that Jerusalem sent some soldiers and had a king, the general of the Jerusalemite, portion of the army. I don't know, but it very definitely records that there was a king of Jerusalem that died during that southern campaign. And you've got a list of other guys, most of which we haven't heard of yet. It just gives this list of everybody that's involved. Okay.
Roger,
Yes.
wasn't the king of Jerusalem involved in that first coalition of the southern kings?
Yeah. If you look back earlier, yeah, he was involved with it. So apparently there was a segment of the army that came out of Jerusalem. So, but why then? It's never mentioned. It's never recorded that they took direct military action against Jerusalem, because he was part of that coalition. Apparently, that's why this guy's name here is somebody that got killed. Okay, So you wonder why Joshua wasn't specifically directed to take out Jerusalem, but apparently he never did. Did he just leave it then to the Judahites?
There's one verse in the first chapter of Judges that says that Judah took Jerusalem and burned it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's not referring to Joshua.
It's not,
the
yes.
Judah people
Yeah,
later
this
on.
would have been after Joshua's time, so to speak. You know, but when Judah was given this part, then eventually they did wind up laying siege to the city, and I don't know how
But
many.
it wasn't according to my map, it wasn't in Judah's territory.
No,
But they took Judah, they took Jerusalem, burned it,
yeah,
killed people, and then later on, there's a verse, I think in the same chapter, that says, it's in Benjamin's territory.
it's actually Benjamin's territory.
And when Benjamin took over, they failed to clean things out.
Uh-huh. You see, if you look at the map, as goofy as this is, you have a specific type. Benjamin and Judah are donut, kind of, okay? Judah is like this, and Benjamin's inheritance is inside of Judah for all practical purposes, you know, and Jerusalem is in the middle of the land that Benjamin was supposed to inhabit. Okay? So it's not really Judah's responsibility, but yet Benjamin, being as small as it was, apparently got help from Big Brother, so to speak, you know, when it came time to clean out Jerusalem. But it didn't happen it didn't happen during these northern-southern campaigns. This was later on, so I'm not trying to run ahead of the dialogue. So, other comments, thoughts? Yeah. Because now you get to, in Joshua chapter 13, you find that Joshua is now old. All of a sudden, he goes from being the leader of the army to being old. Well, he was, what was he, 62 or something like that, in all probability, during the time of this campaign, in his late 50s, early 60s. Let's put it this way: if he was barely 20, in his very early 20s, when he was a spy in the Promised Land, and then 40 years in the wilderness, okay, so he's at the minimum, he's 61 or 2 when he crosses the Jordan at the head of the army. He's a young guy, relatively, at this point, and most of them have no battle experience. They have to learn war, right? So when they go into the Promised Land, and then he spends the next 8 years, so he's about 70. You know, if the chronology adds up, if we do the addition, right? When the 8 years of campaign is finished, this is roughly 1395, 1396 BC, by the way we date things, okay? You've got, they come out of Egypt in 1446, 1446, okay? They spend about a half a year out there messing around, 40 years in the wilderness, so if you kind of do the math, and it's 1405 or 1404 when they head across the Jordan River. 8 years of military campaign, give or take a little bit. Do the math again, 1396, give or take, okay? Israel's, Saul comes to the throne in 1090, right? Serves for 40 years. David comes to the throne in 1050. Solomon comes to the throne in 1010. You know, the three kings, the 120 years of the kingship. Okay? So again, that kind of gives you a chronological idea of the time flow that's in there. Okay? Joshua is now an old man. Now we realize from the end of the book, as well as the start of Judges, that Joshua died at 110. So you've got somewhere in a 40-year period between the end of chapter 12 and the start of chapter 13 that Joshua now is old. I mean, old and stricken in years, okay, he's getting to the point at the end of his life. So you've got a 35, 40-year period in there that just, we don't really know that much about. Except we now get some details in the rest of the book about during this time or shortly after the northern conquest, this part of the land did this part of the land did that. You've got some great stories in here, by the way, one of which concerns Caleb. That is a true delight for me, it really is. I love this story. And then you've got some other this and that's and some serious lists of names and places that, frankly, none of us really commit to memory. You've got some references to other places. You've got things where, are going on, Abner's killing this guy and other things going on, internal politics, before the time of the Israelite kings, okay? Before the time of the judges. Okay? So you've got, again, there's about a 40-year period now that's going to be really described from chapter 13 through the rest of the book. And then you step into the book of Judges. Yes?
It's kind of interesting when you start in chapter 13, the first verse, it says, Now Joshua was old and stricken in years, and the Lord said unto him, Thou art old and stricken in years, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed.
Yeah. So
Lots of work still to do.
there's still a lot of work to do. He's been fighting, he's been encouraging the tribes to take their apportioned land, to secure it, everything that's with it, and it gives a list from here to here and there and there and here and this land and that land, and you get a whole list of ites, as I call them, that still haven't been dealt with. And you can imagine that probably Joshua's not all that happy about it.
His ARP card was
Yeah.
being used.
Yeah, I mean, it's all this stuff. I mean, you got a whole list of them. I mean, the Eshkolonites, a household group, right? I mean, we know them. They're on the tip of our tongue, the Eshkolonites. I don't think they're ever mentioned any place except here. I wouldn't know. I mean, but a small group of resistance fighters against Israel, and we'll learn a little bit about them. And then you've got the Gibeonites, not the Gibeonites, the Gibeonites, and on it goes, okay? So there's a lot of cleanup work that was supposed to get done at the end of Joshua's life, and that's really the remainder of the book, and a lot of it doesn't get done. That's not Joshua's fault. It's because the people found that it's just easier. Most of it's been done. We're really doing good. I think, it's comfortable right now. We don't have to finish all this other stuff up. We can get by just great the way it is. We'll just ignore them. They leave us alone, and we'll leave them alone. It'll be fine, but it's not. If you don't do God's work God's way, it's never fun. Okay. Word of prayer, and then if you've got some questions. Father, thank you for allowing us